Welcome back to the channel. So this is punched, and we are looking at the situation at the end of turn 3 in the tank cemetery scenario for the Grognard Simulations game of Armored Knights Case Blue Don Ben. So this is a German defensive scenario. I think I've described it before elsewhere, so I won't go into a lot of detail now, but suffice it to say that we have the Germans here in the north with a line of hedgehogs, and they are trying to maintain a defense against a determined, if perhaps foolhardy, Soviet offense. So this is the end of turn 3, and I noticed that the Soviets have made no progress. They are the only ones attacking. The Germans are not attacking at all, except for airstrikes, which have been moderately successful. And the Soviets have nothing to show for their hard work, if you will. They have lost 28 steps of casualties at this point. And so I thought, well, maybe I ought to take a look and see what's going on here. Is this just dice? It's bad dice rolling? Is it a game system bias towards the defense? Are the combat results tables biased that way? Is there some other factor going on here? Am I doing things wrong? Because it seems like such a lopsided result. So I figured I would. You notice that I've got all these post-it notes here at the bottom of the picture. This is how I do my combats. There's enough moving parts in a typical combat in the Armored Knights Case Blue system that I don't trust myself to remember everything in my head. So I write it down, and it doesn't take too long. It takes a couple minutes really to go through and figure everything out. But I keep my post-it notes generally, at least for a few turns. And so I thought, well, hold it. I've got raw data here. Let's do some analysis and see what's actually happening and see what the heck's going on. I'd hate to think that I'm spending time doing something wrong in the game system. And so I thought it was worth the effort. In this segment, I'm going to walk through the data collection and analysis and start to get into some of the conclusions here for this scenario. So what I wound up doing was for every turn I listed the Soviet attacks, and I number them per turn so I can keep them fairly straight. I also noted whether the attacks were deliberate. The ones that were not deliberate were hasty attacks. I noted the odds of the attacks, the Soviet die rolls, the die roll modifiers, the German die roll modifiers, whether there was a particularly bad combat proficiency failure. Also noted the die roll modifiers on the combat proficiency, whether there was a bad random combat event. Then I got into actual and net die rolls for the combat, actual and net die rolls for the German side of the combat, Soviet results, German results, and then their effectiveness and such. A few other things. I mean, every attack in the first 3 turns was going up against a hedgehog, and so that wasn't terribly interesting. So the things that I noticed here, we've got averages down here in this particular row. So the first thing I noticed was that the odds were relatively low, and this game is certainly constructed intentionally so that higher odds combats result in better, results, if you will. The attacker gets better results, the defender gets worse results at higher odds ratios. That's intentional, and that's typical of many, if not most, combat systems that are out there. And I noticed that, hey, the Soviets are not doing, they max out at a 3. They do a couple of 3-to-1s at relatively poor die roll modifiers, but 1.9, not very good. The Soviets are usually running at an average of a negative 2.8 die roll modifier. The Germans, for their part, are running at a negative 1.7 die roll modifier. I will also point out that a positive die roll modifiers are good for the attacker, and negative die roll modifiers are good for the defender. So the combats thus far have definitely been skewed in the favor of the German defenders. So let's see. I'm going to skip over a few things here. One of the questions I had was whether the dice rolls were particularly bad. So let's take a look here. All the dice rolls that the Soviets made. These are the actual die rolls, right? This is what showed up on the Soviet die, and they're running a 5.9. That's a little worse than statistical average. A statistical average for a 10-sided die. You add up the values on all the faces and then divide by 10, and you come up with a 5.5. So they're a little worse than statistical average. However, the Germans are worse. You know, they're doing worse than the Soviets are. So they're at a 6.3. So I can't really claim that it's the die rolling that is at issue. And they are using separate dice. There's a red die included in the set for the Soviet and a black die included in the set for the Germans, but regardless of how fair those dice are, the actual outcomes favor the Soviets. Okay, then let's look at those die roll modifiers. Remember that the Soviets, compared to the Germans, they're a negative minus 1.1 difference, and that's showing up in the actual net rolls. So we want higher rolls better, right? Higher rolls give better results for the attacker, and they're getting a 3.1. That is not particularly good. Lower rolls are better for the defender, and they're getting a 4.7. So compared to that 5.5 statistical average, because of die roll modifiers, because of the situational stuff, terrain, hedgehogs, other advantages that accrue to the defender, and insufficient advantages accumulating for the attacker, we have a definite, like a 1.6 difference here. And that is significant. And that is shown in the actual results. So the Soviets are actually getting results out of their attacks. A third of the time, they're either getting a step loss, in this case, or a one-hex retreat. That's what these small lowercase r's happen to be. Unfortunately, the Soviet effectiveness is 0 because a hedgehog absorbs step losses and a hedgehog absorbs one-hex retreats. Okay, the Germans, for their part, they're getting excellent results. Okay, they're getting excellent results. They're getting, all the numbers here are step losses. The star indicates that a supporting arm, such as armor, light anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and so on, must take the first hit. And every place that you see a +1 AR, +2 AR, and so on, those are additional armor step loss casualties that must be taken regardless of the actual German die roll. They must be taken due to the AQRD. It's a comparison between the relative qualities of the armor and anti-tank. And in all of these cases, the Soviets are going up against 88s. The Germans have actually 4 batteries of 88 millimeters that are being used in the defense in an anti-tank role. And that's that gives them quite the advantage. So we see here the total number of step losses under the German effectiveness column and 28 step losses. So the Soviets are trying, and they're getting some results, but the hedgehogs are mitigating those results. Additionally, the odds are usually low enough and the die roll modifiers are favorable enough that the Germans are always causing casualties. Every single attack, right? Whether it's successful or not for the Soviets, because they have to, the Germans are in cover, right? Even without hedgehogs, they would be in a hasty defense. You know, they would be ducking and covering. They would be taking advantage of the terrain, maybe a hasty, a hasty scrape position or foxhole, that sort of thing, right? The Soviets, they have to get up and move, right? They have to move forward in the attack, and so they are definitely paying for it. Let's take a look at the die roll modifiers for the Germans. So for the die roll modifiers, they always have a -1, and that is a veteran unit defending versus a green unit attacking. That's built into the game system. In the cases where they have 88s, they are getting a -1 die roll modifier for heavy anti-aircraft used, used in the defense. On the west side of the line, they have a balka in play, kind of a gully, if you will. For those of you who know the term, it would be similar to a diversion channel or an arroyo or a drainage ditch, depending on what terminology you're familiar with. Right, and of course the hedgehogs. The hedgehogs give that. And I've already mentioned the armor quality rating difference, I think, AQRD, and they're in the German favor from the 88s. Okay, so a couple of things analysis-wise. I wanted to know what kind of bias there was in the game system. Obviously, the game system, particularly at low odds ratios, is biased in favor of the defender. It's certainly possible, even likely, this is a reasonable likelihood, I think, at the relatively low odds, for the Soviets to actually get some kind of result, but the hedgehogs are mitigating it, right? That is the value of field fortifications, even the relatively hasty ones created for hedgehogs. So I wanted to find out, well, how likely is it, let's take a look here, how likely was it for the Soviets to get a bad random combat event? And it turns out that looking at the combat proficiency table, 30% of the time in the 1 hex or 2 hex column, they're going to get a bad random combat result. That's just the base, right, without any die roll modifiers. And these are green troops, so they tend to shift into a regime, and in fact these are green troops. The green troops are in play. So for green troops, 30% of the time they're going to get a bad random combat event, and if they attack with 3 hexes, they're going to get a bad random combat event 40% of the time. So this is quite an issue. Now I also wanted to find out, okay, for each of the odds, right, 5 to 1, 2.5, 0.5 to 1, and so on, how likely was it that the Soviets would get some effect, well, that was effective, right? How likely were they going to get either a 2 hex retreat or 2 or more step losses? And that's what you need to get when you're fighting against a hedgehog. 2 or more step losses will at least inflict 1 step loss on troops that are protected by a hedgehog. And the retreat result will actually cause a hedgehog 2 to, you'll have to pick up the hedgehog 2 or the hedgehog 1. Presumably enough damage has been done to the hedgehog that it is no longer a factor in play. And so you can see that some of these are reasonable. Obviously at 5 to 1 we have 40%. We have some 30s at 30% in different cases. I might be off there. That doesn't seem like it's quite right. Oh, and this is taking into effect the die roll modifiers. So with a 0 die roll modifier, we're at the base odds of the chart, whereas here we've got a high negative die roll modifier for the attacker, and that's why this is only a 10% instead of a 30%. But you can see that we want higher odds, and we would prefer lower die roll modifiers, and that's the lesson basically of this analysis. Also take a look at the Germans. So I also wanted to know, okay, well, for the odds and the die roll modifiers, what are the average German results? And those defending results are typically they're going to be in terms of step losses. If you get to low, um, particularly low odds ratios and particularly favorable, i.e. negative die roll modifiers on the defensive side, you can also cause the attacker to retreat, typically a 2-hex retreat. But I really wasn't too concerned with those in this analysis. And you can see that the average is pretty good. You know, you take the 10 slots on the combat results table at the odds for the German die roll modifiers, add them up and divide by 10, and that gives you gives you an average. And then I averaged all of the different attacks, and it looks like 1.7 is the average. And if you look at the number of attacks that we have, let me do a quick count of those. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 attacks, right? So let's do the math on that. So 15 times 1.7, 25.5 step losses over 15 attacks average. So we did a little bit better, right? If you recall, if you recall, the number of step losses was 28, right? That's only 2.5 more than this average. However, because of the 88 millimeter guns, we got an extra 4 step losses. So I think that we actually did a bit lower than normal. Anyway, okay. So that's the analysis. What can we conclude? And it looks like the Soviets are attacking at too low an odds ratio. Okay, they are attacking at the strong points of the German defense, but that is intentional. In other words, they're always attacking where there's a hedgehog, particularly. Let's try this. Note these deliberate attack locations here. There's one to the west and there's one to the east. And they're always attacking typically where there is a hedgehog too. This is a later progression. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. But the location where, try this location right, oh, that's horrible. Red, try red. Nope, not so good. Well, hopefully this is visible. My scribbles here. This particular location was previously occupied by German troops in a Hedgehog 2. It's sort of intentional that these are the strong points in the defensive line. They're going to have a few more troops defensively, and they're going to have Hedgehog 2s instead of Hedgehog 1s. Why is that? Well, you notice that the Soviets are attacking with three stacks of units in both locations. And so that was an intentional analysis on the part of the German defensive player to say, hey, I better be strong where I can be attacked most effectively. For their part, the Soviets, they are attacking where they can attack most effectively. These are the only 2 hexes initially from which you can launch an attack with 3 stacks of units. All right. So conclusions. The Soviets need to attack with at least, I would say, 3.5 to 1 odds. I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer to go into your combat results table and look up the differences. I might get into the CRT a bit here in a later segment. Not entirely sure. But at 3.5 to 1 odds, you start to get to a point of diminishing returns where the defensive price, if you will, for the attack is low, and your odds of accomplishing something are significantly higher. Let's see what else. So it's better to have fewer larger attacks, fewer larger, more effective attacks, than it is to have more weaker attacks. At one point, I was trying hasty attacks. I was trying single hex attacks in some cases. I think I might have been doing so here. I think I might have been doing so here as well. Not entirely sure. But let's see. Those don't actually work too well, right? It costs too much. Those play into the defensive strengths. So best not to do that. Also, one thing I concluded was, hey, maybe not attacking in the western sector, right? Maybe not attacking over here to the west where they have the Balka, maybe attacking more to the east. But I continued to do that in subsequent turns anyway, and I ultimately did get a payoff. So also, obviously you want to attack the weaker hexes. It's difficult to manage because the Armored Knights Case Blue game system has Fog of War in effect, which means I can read, actually in this case, I can't read any of, you can't unstack your enemy's hexes and get full intelligence on what's going on. And in fact, if they are under a hedgehog, all you can see is the hedgehog. Now you can look at the size of the stack, right? Clearly we've got a lot of units here. We don't have very many units here, that sort of thing. You're allowed to do that. And you get to find out what the odds ratio is, right? And what the various defensive modifiers are when you actually take combat. And of course the astute player will be observing their opponent stacking and unstacking hexes. But I'm not really, I'm not the kind of guy who can count cards in Vegas and really make it work. My memory just isn't that good. So the Fog of War is definitely foggy for me. All right, for the German defense, I think they are doing a good job. You know, they've got the hedgehogs. They want to have a setup. Sorry, the hedgehog 2s are in the correct places, which is the vulnerable spots. The hedgehog 2s were in every location where at least 2 stacks of enemy units could come in, and that's about as good as it gets. I think I might have preferred to put more hedgehog 2s over on the east, but they don't really confer that much of a die roll modifier, and the difference between a 2 and a 1 is just not that great. I did notice and started to execute. You see this one lone hedgehog back from the defensive line here in the east. Hopefully that's at least somewhat visible. This was the start of a secondary defensive line that I began starting on turn 3, and I was intending to extend it out on turns 4 and 5, and we'll get to that in a bit. And I thought, well, this is where I'm more vulnerable. The terrain is more open. There's no Balka, and so on. I actually thought better of that, and I will probably get into a separate video on defensive considerations. This is going long. This particular segment is a really long one, but there's a fair amount to say. Let's see. One thing I did not do was I did not take advantage of opportunities to upgrade to hedgehog 2s where there were 1s. I started, you'll see here in the north center, this location right here, that I did actually begin to do just that. One thing that I discovered later on was I actually moved the engineering unit and other units over here, taking advantage of combat supply, so that I could have units in place ready to prepare a fallback position. And let's go ahead and let's segue into the next segments, and we'll get into those considerations. Okay, in this final segment, we'll talk about what went on in turns 4 and 5 in the game. We're looking at the end of turn 5 right here, but I think we can talk about turn 4 as well reasonably. So you'll note that I've identified 2 hexes here, one on the left and one on the right, and then I've got the combat information for the 2 critical attacks into this hex on the left. So first off, let's talk about the turn 4. So in turn 4, I put the analysis advice into good use, and I tried to get a high odds ratio attack. Was able to get one with a relatively low die roll modifier, so doing my best to stack the deck, so to speak, and having a decent enough combat proficiency roll in which I only got a -1 die roll modifier. So And we wound up with a 2-hex retreat. So didn't get a particularly good die roll on the part of the Soviets, but with the odds and with the good die roll modifier, things finally caught up, and we got the 2-hex retreat, which made the hedgehog go away, which left the German units still in the same hex, and of course, as usual, there was a price to pay for that, a total of 3 step losses, one of which had to be armor. So an expensive attack, basically the equivalent of losing a battalion to get just that result, so digging them out of their hedgehog. So the hex over here that I've identified on the upper right hand side of the screen with that arrow, that was in turn 4. Was it turn 4? Yeah, based on the analysis in turn 4, I had is that correct? No, I don't think so. In turn 5, as a result, I moved an engineering unit and an artillery unit over to the hex as indicated by the arrow. That's not quite the path they took, but close enough. And to do that, I put 3rd Motorized Division in combat supply. All the preceding game turns, I had not used combat supply at all. It wasn't particularly necessary, but I needed the better movement to get the units over there in the first place because they are mechanized, motorized units. It also preserved the ability, it turned out with the combat supply, it was a half move for the artillery unit, and so I could still utilize those for defensive purposes. And the idea was that, okay, I've lost a hedgehog here in the hex to the on the left-hand side. I've lost the hedgehog, but if they can hold position, then in turn 6, yeah, it was turn 6? That's what it was. In turn 6, I would be able to create another hedgehog and so preserve the line. That did not actually happen, so looking here at the second post-it note, roughly the middle of the screen left side, the Soviets are launching another attack. Look at the die roll modifiers. Those are horrendous die roll modifiers. And part of this is, again, it's due to the correlation of forces. They got a bad random combat event of poor leadership, which resulted in an extra -2 die roll modifier. They had taken, I believe, they had wound up with they wound up with some really bad die roll modifiers. They had the Balka, they had the poor leadership, and so on. One of the units did not get artillery after the attack was broken up into separate penny packet attacks, and so they took an extra -2 because they had no artillery or air support. But interestingly enough, we got a no result, not surprising, with the lower odds attack at the worst die roll modifiers, but we did get a single hex retreat. 2.5 to 1 odds, -7 die roll modifier, but they got a fairly decent die roll. Looks like they got a 10, minus the 7 was a 3, and they got that R. That's what I think I wrote down there. So they pushed back the Germans, and this is very typically what you're going to see is in Armored Knights Case Blue, your attacks do not cause all that many casualties. What they do, however, is they push the defending units out of position. Right? They dig them out of their defensive works, their hedgehogs, their fortifications, and they push them back. And particularly if you notice the lay of the land here, the Germans are basically at the narrowest point of a funnel that opens out behind them. And so as the Soviets push them back, the Germans will have to thin their line out to maintain a contiguous front. They may have to abandon this line of hedgehogs, at least partially, again, in order to maintain that front. Remember that if even one hex, right, going from south of the line to north of the line is left open, the Soviets can pour through that gap. These are 2.5 kilometer hexes, and the zones of control are not sticky in this game, right? So you can freely, with the cost, move through a hex that only has a zone of control extended into it. So that's what's going on here. So quick recap. The Soviets basically were not attacking effectively. They were paying the price for doing it. Now I've kind of learned the lessons of that. It only took me 3 turns and 28 step losses, and most of the tanks, by the way, that were available. I think we're down to, I want to say that we're down to 6, maybe 6 steps worth of tanks. Not doing all that well here. And again, this scenario is called the Tank Cemetery, and I think it has lived up to its name, at least in this particular go-around. So the question is, we're coming up onto the second day. We have 6 game turns left, and the question is, can the Germans hold on? The Soviets, for their part, they're getting into the point of diminishing returns because of so many casualties that they have taken. Yet they are still fairly strong. The Germans have not had a single step loss yet. They've taken a few losses, a couple of step losses in their air units, and their air units are quite fatigued after the first day, so we'll see how much good they're going to be on the second day. But that's what we got. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like it if you will, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks.